Bayshore, the founder of the Sugar Arts Institute, and I'm going to show you today how I cover my cakes with fondant. I like to work with the ATECO products. They're such good quality and high quality products. To roll the fondant out, I like working with their plastic rolling pin. It fits my hands really well, and I find that I don't have aching shoulders or arms as one often does working with the wooden rolling pins. This is really easy to grip. To trim off the fondant, once I've covered the cake, I work with the ATECO fondant wheel. It's nice and sharp, it cuts nice and cleanly on the edge of the fondant. And you'll notice here on my surface that I have an ATECO silicone mat. This is the most important tool in my toolbox. The silicone mat, I use it for practically all my confectionery work. I use it for covering the cake with fondant, I use it with chocolate work, I use it with sugar veil, and I also use it with blown and pulled sugar. It's an extremely versatile product. With this mat, the first time it's used, it needs to be cured like one cures a pan. So I very lightly cover the surface with shortening. Make sure that the full surface is covered, and then using a dry paper towel completely wipe off the excess. So that will give you a nice smooth surface and will prevent the fondant sticking to the mat. Now this isn't something that needs to be done every time the mat is used, perhaps once or twice a month depending on the frequency of use. However, it needs to be done and cured every time it's thoroughly cleaned. I clean my mat using an all-natural cleaner, spray it over the mat, wipe it off, spray water onto the mat and wipe that off, and then cure it again. I'm going to be working with fondant. You'll notice that I do not have any cornstarch or powdered sugar on the mat. That has a drying effect to the fondant and often creates the elephant skin look. By using the ATECO mat, you can bypass all that mess. Working with the rolling pin, I'm going to roll it until I get it nice and even. You can see that I have rolled my fondant really thinly. I find that in my travels around the world, there is a common denominator issue with fondant, and that is that most people don't like to chew their frosting, not only in this country but around the world. And so for me, having my customer 100% satisfied with their cake is essential. So in order to roll the fondant super thin, I roll it out using the rolling pin, and then I work with a sliding motion, and I'm going to show you what I mean. Work with the rolling pin, grip it, and using your weight, slide back and forth. Don't press too firmly onto the fondant, otherwise you'll create an indentation which will prevent you from sliding it back and forth. So slide it. The reason I do the sliding is because when rolling, it is easy to get the sides nice and thin, but not the middle, because the pressure is on the edge of the rolling pin. By sliding, you can bring your hands a little closer together, and what you're effectively doing is pushing the fondant out from the center, thereby thinning it from the center and stretching it out. And what that does, it gives you a nice even thinness so that the center isn't thick and the outside thin. The whole piece of fondant is nice and thin. Another thing I wanted to mention to you, the beauty of this technique, by not using cornstarch or powdered sugar and by using the ATECO silicone mat, is that you can patch it up. I can see that I'm a little bit short on this side. Instead of kneading it up and starting all over again, I'm just going to add a little bit of fondant to the edge. Roll it in with the rolling pin until it's well adhered, and then slide. You'll see that this will stick to the rolling pin this will stick to the mat. The fondant will stick to itself, and by sliding back and forth, you're actually eliminating any joins or creases that a join may leave. You're eliminating any creases or join marks in the fondant. Again, finish off by smoothing it out. Focus on the center, and I'm going to show you how thin this fondant is. Pick this up. Look how thin my fondant is. If you cover your cake with a good coating of buttercream, you can roll your fondant super thin, giving the cake that beautiful and elegant appearance and the smoothness of fondant without the chewiness of fondant. So once I have this smoothed out, I'm then going to take my cake and place the fondant on top of it. Always make sure that your cake is sitting flat on the surface. Pick the fondant up on the mat, and you can see that it adheres to the mat. It doesn't slide off. If you're working with cornstarch or powdered sugar, it will slide off. It's not necessary to roll it onto a rolling pin. The mat is going to hold it really well. And the great thing about working with the mat is you can actually center. You can actually see where you're going with the fondant, and you can center it. I'm having a look here. It looks nice and even to me. And then very gently, and look how thin this is. Just very gently peel the fondant off the mat. Get a good start all the way around, and you can see the fondant is not tearing at all. One of the best fondants on the market is Satin Ice. It has a lot of stretch to it. You can see that I'm pulling the mat away from the fondant. Isn't that easy? And then I'm going to smooth the fondant and push it very gently against the side of the cake. To adhere the fondant to the cake and to mold it to the shape of the cake, I like to work with the sponge brushes because I have a handle that I can use to control where the fondant's going. And very gently stretch out the fondant, and gradually, by going all the way around the cake, mold the fondant to the shape of the cake. It is so much easier to handle when working with a sponge, and I also then don't get my fingernails caught in the fondant. Stretch the fondant open. Make sure, I'm a little short, as I mentioned earlier, so I can't see over there, so with the base of your hands, feel to make sure that that fondant is sitting right up against the cake and that it's sitting firmly on the cake board. You don't want to have the fondant pulled out, otherwise when you go to cut it, it's going to make the fondant short and you'll see the buttercream underneath. Using the palms of your hands, which is the warmest part of your hands, gently polish the fondant to give it that lovely silky sheen. Don't let the fondant move on the table, otherwise it's going to tear from the edge of the cake. And then working with the fondant wheel, trim as closely to the edge as you possibly can. Keep it nice and close, and then pull away the excess. look how much fondant you have left over. This has not been contaminated with cornstarch or powdered sugar, so you can just knead this up and put it back in the bucket and reuse it. It's not contaminated. So look how much you have saved by not contaminating it, and look how thinly you've been able to roll it out.